Midnight on the air, the night the signals revealed themselves. September 8, 1944. 03:12 a.m. A cold, salt-laden wind wrestled with the radio masts above a small coastal listening post in Suffolk, England. The lamps inside the hut threw hard ovals across a battered wooden table. Paper maps, pencil smudges, and a clutter of valves and dials lay like a surgeon's instruments. Outside, the night was a black, breath-held thing. Inside, the air smelled of cigarette smoke, solder, and the faint metallic tang of cooled vacuum tubes. Dr. Reginald V. Jones sat hunched over a battered cathode ray oscilloscope, the glow from its screen painting his face a sickly green. He was not the sort of man to wear rank with ostentation. He preferred the precision of measurements to the pomp of titles. But here, he carried the weight of the Air Ministry's newest secret on his shoulders. A suspicion that the Germans had married rocketry and cunning radio work in a way that could change the face of the war. He was a scientist given the dark task of listening to things the world did not yet understand. Around him, a small team worked like an orchestra of the clandestine. Sergeant Thomas "Tommy" Ellis, a wiry radio operator with the permanent gravel of cigarettes in his voice, turned a tuning knob so slowly the movement was almost reverent. Corporal May, a plotting specialist, traced a flicker on a dotting map with the tip of a pencil. A teleprinter in the corner clattered like a nervous bird as intercepted Morse fed into the room, garbled fragments, rhythms that didn't belong to convoys or Luftwaffe admissions. The sound came through the headphones first, a faint, rhythmic ping beneath the static like a heartbeat under frozen water. Jones' gloved finger hovered above the frequency band on the receiver. The ping shifted, modulated in a way that had geometry, an engineer's dialect. He leaned in, breath fogging the glass of the oscilloscope, and felt in the way scientists do the small thrill when pattern breaks free from noise. "This isn't ordinary telemetry," Jones murmured, not to be dramatic but because stating the obvious focused the room. He had been chasing whispers of guided weapon experiments for months, fragments from captured papers, reports from agents, the odd mathematics scribbled in a prisoner's pocket. He had argued them into a hypothesis. Somewhere in the Reich, men were trying to make a missile that could steer itself. But hypothesis is not proof. Proof came as pattern. The pulse repeated. Each sequence rose, steadied, then dropped, an electronic signature that suggested automatic control, course corrections, a nervous little handshake between components. Ellis adjusted the loop aerial, flicked a switch, and suddenly the ping shifted to a harmonic that Jones recognized, a steering update, not crude telemetry, not mere tracking. This was guidance language, commands and replies, a hidden conversation between brain and missile. Jones felt the room narrow to the rhythm of those beeps. He barked orders: measure the pulse width, log the carrier frequency, sample the sidebands, and the team obeyed with machine-like efficiency. The oscilloscope traced the waveform as if the signal had been arrested and pinned to the glass, a series of pulses, each one carrying a tiny parcel of information. Jones translated the parcels into words in his head, rudimentary, inexact, but enough. Bearing adjustments, rate corrections, a repeat to confirm receipt. Signals directional, May said quietly, leaning over the map where bearings were being fastidiously crossed. Triangulation puts it east of the Rhine. Industrial corridor, could be. Peenemund, someone whispered, the name falling like a stone. Even in the hush, the word sounded dangerous. Jones did not nod. He felt the danger differently, not as a scrap of geography but as the impact of an invisible weapon moving through space, steered by secrets. He had to know more. He had to turn this proof into advantage. That required not only ears but imagination, a scientist's willingness to believe the impossible and then to find the lever that made it true. He pushed himself back from the table, muscles protesting the hour, and walked to the wall where a whiteboard was mounted. With a stub of pencil he sketched, quick, economical, the waveform shape, the periodicity, and a crude model of how a guidance loop might decode the pulses into corrective actions. He labeled axes, wrote down derivations, and then underlined one phrase: receiver lock vulnerable to confusion. The words felt like a key turning in an unseen lock. If their enemies' missiles listened for tiny pulses to tell them where to go, what if those pulses could be blurred, shifted, or stolen? What if the guidance language, the invisible conversation that Jones had just intercepted, could be made to sound wrong to the receiving missile? It was a daring, almost blasphemous thought, to jam not the launch site, not the factory, but the missile's ears. Outside, the broadcasting mast sighed. Inside, the small team of scientists and operators were already moving, preparing recordings of the intercepted pulses, patching a nearby radar jammer into a loop, and sketching out a deception like musicians rehearsing a counterfeit song. Jones watched as his colleagues set up primitive delays, phase shifts, and amplitude tweaks. The plan was crude on the bench, elegant in intention. Make what the missile hears disagree with what it expects, nudge its autopilot into doubt, and let physics and inertia do the rest. No one in the room used the word sabotage. There was no need. They were scientists wielding instruments. Their weapons were mathematics and interference. But there was also an edge of theater to it, of playing the enemy at a game he thought only he understood. Jones put the headphones back on. The rhythm filled his skull. He traced the pulses with the tip of his finger as if they were a delicate fossil. Somewhere across the sea, a factory hummed and men in workshop coats adjusted bearings and calibrations, blissfully ignorant that their private talk was being listened to, logged, and if Jones' hypothesis held, prepared to be imitated and manipulated. He wrote down one last note on the whiteboard before the team moved into action. If we can inject errors into the guidance loop without revealing the source, delays become plausible, morale and schedule disruption. He looked at the map, at the thin black line of the channel, and then at the oscilloscope's faint glow. In the vestibule of dawn, with a single radio pulse quivering in the dark, he felt the hinge of an idea click into place. An impossible trick that might stop a rocket factory cold without a single bomb dropped on its roof. The invisible counterattack, turning science into sabotage. 2 days later, September 10, 1944, Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire. Rain whispered against the tin roof of Hut 6 as dawn light bled through the mist. Inside, the air was alive with code chatter, bursts of Morse, bursts of voices, the hum of decoding machines. At a small desk pushed against the far wall, R.V. Jones leaned over a map crowded with pins and red strings, a cigarette burning untouched between his fingers. Around him, men in rumpled uniforms and women from the WAAF worked with the mechanical grace of those who have forgotten what silence feels like. Jones had brought with him a new puzzle, a slim roll of magnetic tape carrying the intercepted signal, and a question. Could the enemy's V-2 rockets really be listening to the air? He pressed play on the reel-to-reel machine. The same rhythmic pulse that had haunted the Suffolk night filled the hut, faint and mechanical, like a heartbeat translated into code. The team gathered cryptanalysts, physicists, and radio experts, their faces caught in the flicker of the oscillograph's beam. "This is not command guidance," muttered Alan Hunter, a radio specialist from the RAF's telecommunications research establishment. "No operator steering it from the ground. It's feedback mid-course correction. The rocket's ears are tuned to this carrier, and it listens until it reaches burnout." Jones nodded slowly. "Exactly, which means if we sing louder, it listens to us instead." The room went quiet. What he proposed was radical. The V-2's guidance loop relied on a Doppler radio system, a continuous wave signal reflected back from the missile. By comparing the phase difference between sent and received waves, the system could determine velocity and adjust thrust accordingly. If that phase was altered, even slightly, the missile's brain would believe it was flying too fast or too slow, and it would compensate incorrectly. "Jam it wrong," Jones continued, "and they'll think the rocket's misfiring. The fix, they'll correct the wrong thing over and over." It was elegant, it was invisible, and it was nearly impossible. The first tests began in secret that same week. In a sealed chamber at TRE Malvern, engineers built a mock-up of the V2's radio loop based on captured components and intelligence reports. The machine was temperamental, wires humming, vacuum tubes glowing orange, dials twitching like nervous eyelids. The lab smelled of ozone and solder. Jones stood with his sleeves rolled up, eyes fixed on the oscilloscope as an engineer flipped a switch. A steady pulse filled the air. Then another tone, faint, slightly offset, joined it. The two signals clashed, producing a low-frequency beat pattern that pulsed through the room like a hidden drum. "That's it," Jones whispered. "Now modulate the phase 5 degrees." The trace on the screen began to wobble. The loop faltered. The guidance simulation's output drifted wildly off course. It worked. The false signal confused the guidance logic. The missile, in theory, would now believe it was veering the wrong way and steer itself into a slow, invisible death spiral. By midnight, Jones had drafted the outline of a plan. Field deploy mobile jammers along the Channel coast to interfere with any guidance transmissions they detected. The deception had to be subtle, just enough phase distortion to disrupt accuracy, but never so strong that the Germans suspected deliberate interference. Every equation, every adjustment had to carry the delicate art of camouflage. A few days later, under a shroud of secrecy, a group of RAF trucks rolled into position near Dover. They carried what looked like radar sets, modified Ames Type 7 units reconfigured to emit counterphase signals at frequencies near the V2's telemetry band. Their mission was simple but surreal: fight a silent war in the airwaves, against rockets they might never see. When the first V2 launches were detected, faint tracking pulses skipping across the North Sea, Jones was in the control trailer, headset clamped to his ears. "Hold transmission until lock," he ordered. The pulse arrived, steady, precise. Then, with a nod, he gave the command, "Now." The jammers awoke. Invisible energy rippled out over the channel, meeting the German signal halfway. Oscilloscopes fluttered. The interference graph spiked, and somewhere deep inside occupied Europe, in a hardened hangar where technicians monitored launch telemetry, a faint confusion began to creep across their instruments. The missile's response loop oscillated erratically, first too slow, then too fast. Correction data made no sense. Engineers on the German side argued over faulty valves, calibration errors, humidity. None suspected an enemy hand twisting their invisible dials. Over the next week, launch after launch failed to meet its range targets. Some rockets veered wildly off course. Others detonated mid-flight. None reached their intended precision. The V2 program faltered quietly, inexplicably. Jones' plan had worked. The impossible trick was now in motion, hidden beneath layers of technical confusion and bureaucratic frustration deep within the Reich's research facilities. The Germans had no idea they were being jammed. They blamed their own math, their own manufacturing tolerances, their own fatigue. In a war of bombs and blood, this was something new, an invisible duel of frequencies and logic. And as Jones lit another cigarette in the damp coastal wind, he realized with a quiet pride that this victory left no crater, no fire, no ruin, only silence where terror was meant to fall. Shadows over Peenemünde, the factory that forgot how to aim. October 2, 1944. Peenemünde Army Research Center, Baltic coast. Dawn rolled across the Baltic like cold iron. Inside the sprawling complex of hangars and workshops, engineers in gray coats trudged through corridors that smelled of oil, graphite, and failure. The test stand was quiet, too quiet. Overnight, another rocket had gone astray. It hadn't exploded on launch, nor been intercepted. It had simply missed. On the observation deck above the launch field, Major General Walter Dornberger stood with his hands clasped behind his back, jaw tight, coat collar pulled high against the wind. Below, A team of technicians disassembled the wreck of a V-2 that had been retrieved from a muddy field. Its casing was twisted, its guidance compartment scorched but intact. A junior engineer held up the gyroscopic package like a heart torn from a corpse. Dornberger's aide, pale with exhaustion, handed him a clipboard. Telemetry shows no obvious power failure. Thrust readings were nominal until second phase correction. Then Dornberger asked, eyes narrowing. Velocity spike, then a correction in the opposite direction. The guidance loop oscillated violently. Flight path drifted 6 kilometers off target before burnout. The general's fingers tightened on the clipboard. It was the 5th such failure this week. And you are certain this isn't mechanical? Completely, Herr General. The problem is unseen. Unseen. The word hung in the air like a curse. Across the hall, the young engineer Werner von Braun paced in circles, chalk in hand, muttering to himself as he scribbled equations on a blackboard crowded with vectors and waveforms. He'd spent nights chasing phantoms, recalibrating circuits, adjusting feedback amplifiers, even blamming atmospheric distortion. None of it explained the erratic readings. The guidance loop wasn't just noisy, it was being lied to. And yet, who could possibly be lying? The thought was almost heretical. The Allies didn't even know how to build a V-2, much less interfere with its electronic brain. Still, von Braun couldn't shake the sense that something was speaking to his rocket in mid-flight, something whispering falsehoods into the ether. Back in England, R.V. Jones read the German reports with a quiet smile. Intelligence intercepts, decrypted fragments from WWII communications, told a story that read like theater. Potential magnetic anomaly detected. Suspect amplifier drift. Possibly cosmic interference. Each excuse made Jones' small circle of engineers grin. Their deception was holding. The Germans didn't suspect human interference. They blamed nature itself. From his operations post near Dover, Jones refined the trick further. Using captured telemetry samples, he tailored jamming profiles that matched each new frequency shift the Germans introduced. The process was painstaking: measure, calculate, distort, observe. But the results were devastatingly effective. In one intercepted launch log, the Peenemünde staff complained that a rocket had turned gently away from its course as though distracted. Another simply fell from the sky without reason. Each failure delayed production. Each unexplained anomaly drained confidence. The V-2 program, once the crown jewel of Nazi engineering, began to resemble a house built on fog. But the work carried weight beyond science. For Jones, the mission had become personal. Every rocket that failed to reach London meant lives saved, children, mothers, entire streets spared from sudden, senseless annihilation. Yet he knew this invisible war had to remain secret. If the Germans ever realized their signals were being sabotaged, they would encrypt or change frequencies, and the window would close forever. So the deception continued in absolute silence. Late one night, under the dim light of his Malvern laboratory, Jones sat alone, headphones resting around his neck, a fresh set of recordings spooling across the reel-to-reel. The signal pulsed steadily, clean, predictable, mechanical. He began to modulate the counterphase tone by hand, adjusting dials in tiny increments until the interference pattern on the scope danced perfectly out of phase. The trace began to collapse, a waveform folding into nothing. Jones smiled faintly. "Good night, Peenemünde," he murmured and switched off the machine. The next morning, at the rocket test range hundreds of miles away, a launch crew watched in confusion as their missile lifted flawlessly into the gray sky. And then, with eerie calm, veered 15 degrees off course and vanished into the sea. The engineers blamed a defective gyroscope. The generals blamed bad luck. No one blamed a man in England with a pencil, a radio, and a mind sharp enough to bend invisible waves. The war no one saw, when silence became a weapon. November 1944. London. The city still carried its scars, bombed-out terraces, twisted tram lines, walls painted with the ghostly shadows of buildings that used to stand. But in the heart of the Air Ministry, behind doors marked classified, ultra-secret, the war was being fought by men who never fired a bullet. Dr. R.V. Jones stood in the briefing room, sleeves rolled, chalk dust on his cuffs. The air smelled of tobacco and paper warmed by desk lamps. Before him, on a blackboard crowded with circles and arrows, a line of equations told the story of a battlefield that existed entirely in the invisible. "The Germans believe their guidance valves are faulty," he said, voice low but steady. "They've begun triple testing their circuits, but the faults aren't mechanical, they're mathematical. They don't realize they're flying into a fog of their own making." Across the table, Air Marshal Sir Robert Renwick frowned. "How long can we keep this up?" Jones tapped the side of his chalk. "As long as we stay subtle. We're not breaking their system, we're whispering into it. If they suspect interference, they'll harden the signal or shift the frequency band. We must remain a ghost." He paused, letting that word hang. Ghost, it fit perfectly. Over the next weeks, British mobile units along the coast operated like phantoms, moving under cloud cover, setting up their dishes on foggy cliffs and abandoned airfields. They transmitted for mere seconds at a time, never from the same location twice. Every time the telltale pulse of a V-2 was detected, their equipment flared to life, adding just enough confusion to the signal to ruin a trajectory, a whisper that bent death itself off course. Inside the control trucks, the world shrank to dials and static. Operators worked with military precision, marking each intercepted launch on grease pencils over transparent maps. One officer joked that they were painting ghosts over Germany. When a rocket failed to reach London, cheers were silent, just a few exchanged glances, a note logged, another cigarette lit. They couldn't celebrate openly. Their victories existed in the space between silence and destruction. By Christmas, reports showed the effect clearly. German V-2 strikes had dropped dramatically in accuracy. Missiles landed in open countryside in the sea or failed entirely. Berlin's scientists, baffled, tore apart their circuits and recalibrated their test rigs. They replaced valves, resoldered amplifiers, cursed the Baltic weather, and filed technical reports that read like prayers to physics. Jones read every one. "They're chasing ghosts," he told his staff, "exactly as planned." But the weight of secrecy pressed heavy on him. Each night, he returned to his office long after the others had gone, sitting by the window with a cup of cold tea and the low hum of distant city generators. Outside, the searchlights still swept the sky, as if the city itself couldn't quite believe it was safe. He thought of the rockets that had landed, the lives lost before his invisible shield had taken hold, and he wondered if any victory in war could truly be clean. He was not a soldier. He was a man of numbers, a scientist. Yet his equations had become a weapon, one that killed quietly by confusion instead of explosion. It was a strange kind of warfare, elegant, abstract, bloodless on his end but deadly all the same. In early January 1945, an ultra-decrypt arrived on his desk. German engineers at Middlework reported catastrophic setbacks. The words "unexplained interference" appeared for the first time, a chilling sign that their suspicions were beginning to turn outward. Jones stared at the report for a long time. Then, without a word, he picked up his pen and wrote a single directive to the jamming stations. Reduce transmission strength by 10%, maintain random intervals, make it look like weather. He wasn't fighting for glory. He was fighting for invisibility. The less the enemy knew, the longer the advantage lasted. By March, the V-2 program was in disarray. Production slowed to a crawl. Hitler's so-called vengeance weapon had become a logistical nightmare. And though some rockets still struck, their power to terrify was fading, drowned in the fog of failure and self-doubt. On a quiet morning in April, as Allied troops crossed the Rhine. A final report reached Jones' desk from the intercept team at Dover. No new V2 telemetry detected, channels silent. He set down the paper. The silence was complete. He exhaled, long, slow, disbelieving. For months he had waged war through mathematics and static. Now, for the first time, the airwaves were empty. Outside, spring sunlight touched the ruins of London. Inside, Jones simply said, "It's over," and turned off the receiver that had guarded a nation with nothing more than a hum.